Now, welcome. We have approximately 20 people joining in already, and I really appreciate having you join us. Our topic today is the importance of understanding ethical risk to an organization's reputation and integrity. And Dr. Anne Fraser of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has been very kind to agree to do this webinar for us. A couple of preliminaries. Please use the phone line or computer audio. The voice lines are muted to reduce interference, but if you want to, whoops, went ahead. If you want to ask a question, you can in effect raise your hand to request speaking privileges. And you can also put written messages in the question box and send those at any time, whether it's some technical issue or if you want to join in the discussion. We will put the presentation on the EPAC website. And also, je sais qu'on a des francophones qui ont testé de participer, écouter à cette présentation qui est déjà disponible en français. Donc, on pourra essayer de vous envoyer la présentation immédiatement si vous voulez les suivre pendant la présentation. Donc, envoie-nous un message à cette fin. Puis, I don't have to tell you where the washrooms are because you're in your own place and know where to go for them. Just about EPAC, for those of you who are not very familiar with it, we're an organization about 20 years old that promotes ethical principles and practices in organization across Canada. The main things that we want to do are to provide networking opportunities such as, and educational opportunities such as this webinar. Our vision is of a world where people act in organizations ethically, and we encourage you to become a member. Please visit our website. And I will now hand it over to Dr. Fraser. I'll end this show and go to the other show that's down here. Good. Let's get started. And here we go. And Anne, when you want me to advance the slides, please ask me to do so.
Okay, well, yeah, Bob and I are sitting side by side in the room, and certainly raise your hand if you're not able to hear me, because I'm speaking over to his laptop, and Bob will be changing the slides for me. I'm really happy I am pleased to have been invited to make this presentation to you. I intend to speak to you today about the ethical risk profile work that we have carried out within the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the process we followed, and what we learned about ourselves as an organization, but about the process overall, but also too to explain to you, really in the beginning part of my presentation, why we felt it was so important to actually do ethical risk profiles, or to carry out the ethical risk profile process within our organization, and to understand the ethical risks that our organization could, ethical risks that were actually present within our organization. Then on the slide we have, I've actually jumped up to overall message now. Bob's still working at some things, but this overall message you're going to see at the end of my presentation as well, but we brought it to the front because I want to tell you that if your organization becomes engaged in actually carrying out ethical risk profiles, obviously the one thing that will happen is the ethical risks in your organization will be identified and hopefully mitigated. But just as importantly, moving through a process like this with your employees really does demonstrate the leadership's commitment to the values and ethics of the organization. That becomes clearly evident to all employees, and that is just as important as the actual ethical risks that you identify within your organization. For those of you on the line who may not be familiar, the only reason I'm putting up a slide about the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is only to give you a comparative point with your own organization. We are a science-based we're a federal organization. I'm not sure who's online. You may all be federal, work for the federal government. I do not know. But basically, we are a federal government organization. What's a bit different for us is that we are a regulator, and that makes a little bit of a difference in the kind of ethical risks we might actually face as an organization. We're a medium-sized organization, so we're 7,000 employees, and those employees are located across the country. But what is kind of unique to us is our 7,000 employees work in very different environments and very different types of jobs, even though they address the same mandate. So we have people who work in office towers, we have people in laboratories, we have people in slaughter plants, out in the fields, etc. And each of them deal with different aspects of our business. So, and I'll come back to that because it'll explain why, in part, we have conducted 3 ethical risk profiles within the organization to date. So, as an agency, we actually have a values and ethics strategy. You'll see that that's actually key to an organization becoming values-based. But our strategy does have a vision, and our vision is to establish ourselves as a values-based organization, and we're well on the way to doing that. But what is actually a values-based organization? And a values-based organization, or you might call it an ethical organization, but really it's an organization where the values, and these are the organizational values, are actually embedded in and embodied by the employees. So of the organization. So when we talk about embodied by the employees, it means the values are more than just those words on the walls and the nice little plaques or brochures or pamphlets that you get. The values are actually very conscious, shared, and lived. And they actually are exhibited in the behaviors of the employees. So the employees know what their expected behaviors are by the values of the organization. And when they're embedded, it's the recognition by employees that they should be making the decisions, all decisions within the organization should be based in part on the values of the organization. And finally, too, the values of the organization should be the foundation of all the organization's policies. So, and it becomes important to know that the concept of decision-making and behaviors when we come to talk about ethical risk within the organization. So what are the benefits of being a values-based organization? And here is actually why you start talking about the need for doing ethical risk profiles. There are many, many benefits. And it's really quite interesting because the benefits have really, the understanding of the benefits of being a values-based or ethical organization, the understanding of these benefits have actually come from watching organizations with extreme ethical failures. Looking at, and I mean really a lot of the research when you go into the literature, when you talk to the experts, etc., about this, you know, a lot of it started sort of in the mid-90s when you have the collapse of Enron, you had WorldCom, you had some really major ethical failures within organizations, which unfortunately continue to this day. And we'll talk about in this presentation a more recent one. But when they watched an organization fall, they realized what should have been happening to have prevented actually the failure that did occur within the organization. So they recognize, it's recognized that some of the many benefits of being values-based are you do promote a strong public image and better relations with stakeholders, partners, and others. People trust you. People respect and they trust you. And they trust that you're going to be doing the right thing. So your relationship with them is very strong. It results in better decision making. And that's because decisions, all decisions within the organization, should be based on the values of the organization and other rules and that apply. But if you're basing all your decisions on the values, then they should be pretty consistent and coherent, regardless of where you're making them in the organization. And another one I like on the list, and I will often point out, I'm not going to go through every line on the slide, But basically, one of the strengths of a values-based organization is that it keeps the morale high during periods of change. And the reason it does that is because the employees themselves trust the leadership of the organization. There's a great deal of trust, and they trust that the organization will be doing the right thing. And if the leaders are doing the right thing for the organization itself is the employees, right? Like no organization is an organization without its employees. So if the leaders do what's right for the organization, they're doing what's right for the employees as well. Also important in a values-based organization is you have this increased awareness and understanding of potential ethical problems. So I just want to do a slide of the converse, though. The consequences, and this is why it's so important that you understand what ethical risks might be present in your organization. The consequences of not focusing on values and ethics and the whole ethical culture of your organization are really quite severe. You do get, most people talk about the loss of the public trust in the organization. And when you talk to people, if people lose trust in you and your ability to do your job, even if you are doing the right thing, it becomes a very difficult thing to do because people actually don't believe that you're doing the right thing. So losing trust, and it can take just one incident or one person within an organization to cause that trust to be lost, has very serious consequences on the organization. But you also get the loss of internal trust as well. Right? And that's what I said. The strength of a values-based organization is that employees trust the leaders. If they don't trust them, you also get many, many serious consequences that occur. And that's why you get the loss of employee loyalty or commitment to the organization. You get a lack of or low employee engagement. And I always smile. This inability to achieve a high-performing organization. We talk a lot in the federal government now about wanting to attract high performers or into the organization. But if the culture is not right, a high performer moving into an organization doesn't make the organization high performing. It's the culture that supports the high performer that keeps that high performance. It creates the high performers within the organization. So if the culture is not right, the high performer moves in and either moves out or becomes a non-high performer after the fact. So it truly is the consequences of not focusing on your culture, the ethics of your culture, your ethical culture are severe. And I've highlighted financial consequences because I'm going to show very serious financial consequences in just a moment. So there are, I've been working in values and ethics now for about 10.5 years. And I have learned through my own experiences, but also working with an incredible community of practice within the federal government of Canada. It's a phenomenal group of people who are willing to share best practices or the challenges they faced and how they've had to address these challenges. But also looking in the literature, speaking with the experts in the field, I've come to the creation of this list of 10 key initiatives, which I think are really key to creating and sustaining a values-based organization. I'm not going to go through all of them because I've obviously highlighted, and it's not necessarily a list in order of priority. So ethical risk profiles are not number 9 because they're number 9 on the list. It's just where they've ended up. But doing ethical risk profiles for your organization is absolutely critical. And as I move into it, the reason before I move into looking at the ethical risk profiles itself, just going back to the agency, if you look at any organization at all, not just CFIA, this is just the example of CFIA, but really your vision, your mission, and your values are what provide the ethical foundation for your organization, right? And what can happen with ethical risks is they may actually limit your ability to achieve your vision, to address your mission and reach your values, basically. And I just used this as a sort of a visual of the fact of what these things can do. And this list of, I have two little arrows on it, as you can see. I have fraud and conflict of interest marked with arrows, because many people get quite easily how fraud is an ethical risk or conflict of interest might be an ethical risk. The challenge is there's many things that might cause, that are ethical risks that people don't intuitively think of as risks. And so when you're actually doing a profile of risk in your organization, you really have to get beyond just the fraud and the conflict of interest and what I call the sort of easier ones to deal with. Because, you know, even not allocating risk, like doing allocation of resources, for example, inconsistent with the priorities of the organization, is actually has the potential, it's an ethical risk for the organization. And I'll mention a couple of times this concept of the regulator captured by the regulatee, because that is a real challenge to regulatory organizations. So basically, you want to know where ethical risks exist within your organization so you can mitigate them to ensure that you're always able to achieve your vision, your mission, and the values of your organization. And one of the key, I love this quote. It's from Anne Friedrich, and on ethical risk assessment, crisis prone or crisis prepared. But what she said is, I mean, the whole reason you're doing an ethical risk profile is you want to proactively determine where risks lie, and you either eliminate the source of the risk, and we'll be talking about that when we talk about risk mitigation plans, or you're going to mitigate the risk before it reaches headline proportions. And basically on the next slide, I talk about a real serious ethical breach that reached way more than headline proportions, I would guess. Now, it's almost, it's an event that's over a year old now, but even within the last 2 months, it's been in the headlines if you've been watching it. And this is the case of Volkswagen itself cheating basically on emission tests in both the United States and in Canada. And it was quite interesting when this issue came, hit the headlines, and it was overnight. I mean, from the moment the investigation began, because of the world we live in, there wasn't a person who didn't know what Volkswagen had done, because it was tweeted, it was on every Facebook page. The stock markets dropped the next day. That's how quickly information gets around today. We only can see with Trump and his tweets, the impact on what he's tweeting happens instantaneously. But basically, here, when this first happened, Volkswagen basically said, oh, the problem was a few bad apples within the organization. But it didn't take them very long before they recognized that actually what they had was a culture where, and it says here, the cheating, the employees had decided to cheat on emission tests, and it's employees at many, many, many levels. It was made more than a decade ago. And that the cheating was taking place in a climate of lax ethical standards. There was a tolerance within the organization for breaking the rules. If this organization had been doing any kind of ethical risk profiling or ethical climate survey, but let's call risk profile, they would have known they had a huge issue within the organization. And one thing that's not on these slides is and in this particular article that appeared on December 10th in 2015, they also said too is they knew employees were afraid to speak up. And that was a great ethical risk in the organization. There was one particular person they were deathly afraid of and didn't want to bring issues to, and that person has since been removed. when we talk about the financial implications, if you look at the what I've got here, just in the beginning, by April of last year, they had already, in just the short few months since the crisis began, it had impacted them by 16.2 billion euros, which in Canadian dollars is about 32 billion Canadian dollars. But they began their settlements. So in June of last year, they announced that they were paying $14.7 billion to the U.S. people to settle claims in the U.S. And just within the last 2 months, by the way, they have just made, they're paying out $2.1 billion to settle the claims in Canada. Also, too, they have pleaded guilty to fraud, and so they now have they're paying out $2.1 billion in criminal fines and $1.6 billion in civil fines. But what's interesting is the quote that came out last June from the head of Volkswagen, because it goes to what happens when you have an extreme ethical breach. And that is when he says, we know we still have a great deal of work to do to earn back the trust of the American people. And actually, I remember watching there was a program, a newscast, and they were interviewing one of the American gentlemen who had received his compensation, his brand new car. He was grateful for it. And they gave upwards of $10,000 in compensation to some of the people involved. And despite that, he turned to the camera and he said, you know, I don't think I will ever buy another product from Volkswagen. That's the damage that's done when you breach the trust. So what ethical risk profiling does is it provides these long-term benefits by providing you the early warning that there is the potential for an ethical breach within your organization. And definitely leadership sets the tone here. And really, I'm only repeating what I have said previously, but it has been shown that the absence of a strong ethical framework is the common factor for many large-scale enterprise-wide failures. And bottom line is, if staff feel that it doesn't matter, or nobody cares, basically, it's a real signal to you that there could be issues within your organization. And I said to you that regulatory agencies, we face some unique ethical challenges, and that's the concept that the regulatory staff can actually become intellectually captured by the organizations and industries which they regulate. And there's often churn between them. Even within our organization, we have employees who are now inspectors who previously worked for a party that we once inspected, or we do inspect. And we have people who worked for the regulated party coming to us and becoming inspectors. So there's a lot of work we have to do to ensure that people have the right relationship and they are not influenced in any way by their previous relationships, because then we run an ethical risk as to how decisions are made. So just as we get into the concept of what an ethical risk profile is, it's very similar. It's very similar to a corporate risk profile. It builds on the same premise. Like the approach and the outputs are basically the same. You get your information from documents, reviews, studies, interviews. It is a self-assessment, and you actually develop a risk response. But the focus and the outcome is different. In your corporate risk profile, you're actually identifying risks that impact the delivery of your outcomes. And there's an indirect link to the reputation of the organization. But when you head into ethical risks, an ethical risk profile, you're actually looking for risks that impact on the compliance with all the controls within the organization, and which may cause a breach of the values. And with an ethical risk, it's a direct link to your reputation. If you get the breach, your reputation will definitely be impacted. Now I've talked a lot, and Bob will signal me if someone puts up their hand and says, "Anne, may I interject and just ask a question at this point?" I will. We have time. We should have time for questions at the end. If you have to leave by noon, I should have said this at the beginning, Bob. By 1 o'clock. Sorry, yeah, it's noon now. If you have to leave by 1 o'clock and you have questions for me, we'll provide the contact information. I have no issue following up with you with questions after the fact. So basically, we've been talking about ethical risk profiles, but what exactly is ethical risk? And before we talk about ethical risk, we need to talk about what ethics are. And really, ethics are how your organizational ethics are how the organization uses its values in its decision making, how you put the values of the organization into the decision making process and how employees behave. But for me, I love the simplest definition of ethics, and it's the concept of knowing what's right, knowing what's wrong, and doing the right thing, right? And basically, organizational ethics is really knowing what's right for the organization, knowing what's wrong for the organization, and doing the right thing for the organization. Ethical decision making, a little bit more nuanced than that, because it's not just about choosing between right and wrong. You could be choosing between two right options, right? Options that respect the values of the organization, don't break or bend any of the rules, but you have to select one of them and you choose one as a better option over the other. And that's ethical decision making. And you might be making a good decision, an even better one, or a best one. That's ethical decision making as well. In an ideal world, if you had all the resources that you could ever want, you may make one decision, but you don't. So you make a decision which respects the values, the rules, etc., and the world you're living in, and it's a good decision. And it's an ethical decision. It's not unethical. And actually, that's what I try to explain to employees, is that just because someone makes a decision that you wouldn't make doesn't necessarily mean it's unethical. It just means it's different than the decision you would make. So really, ethical decision making is about making the best decision for your organization, given your values and your rules and policies and guidelines. So if that's ethics, ethical decision making, what is ethical risk? Now, ethical risk is commonly defined as a particular type of uncertainty where the values and the ethics of the organization could be breached. And when I first started and moved into the development of the process for doing ethical risk profiling in our organization, this is the definition I saw. The challenge I have with this definition is exactly what ethical risk is, but it really doesn't guide the people you're going to be talking to. It doesn't help them help you identify potential ethical risks, because it's very, very short definition. So what we did, and what I did within my organization, is crafted a more comprehensive definition of what ethical risk was. And it came out to, it's a combination of factors that might, and one underlines might. Because one of the challenges to ethical risk is just because you identify there's an ethical risk, it doesn't mean it's occurring, right? It's just a risk that you might have to put mitigation measures around. So what you might have is a combination of factors that impact or influence the staff to behave inappropriately or to make inappropriate decisions. Right? So not do the right thing to the, someone have their hand up?
Yes, and I'm going to read a question from one of the people online. And it is fine to have a risk profile for the organization, but like ethics codes, how do you know whether these are being used or followed? Is it common to have ethics audits, or have you seen this tool being used in your experience federally?
Okay.
How can you be sure that these? Well, I guess it's twofold. How can you be sure that codes are being observed? And secondly, more precisely, how can you be sure that these ethics profiles are being applied. But I think you're going to get to that later in
Yeah,
your.
I will certainly get to it because I will certainly talk about what is happening in our organization, because it's very true. You don't want to do an ethical risk profile, come up with an action plan and not implement it. That would actually be quite disastrous for the organization overall. And actually, when we talk about codes being applied in the decision-making process, I'll talk about the fact that it's the interviews we do and the questions we ask of the people as we try to develop what the ethical risks are in the organization. We actually ask those kinds of questions, right? Do you actually see the policies being followed? Do you actually see, you could do it from the positive point of view. Are these things being done? And you can swing it also from the negative point of view. Have you seen instances where it's not occurring? And you get a fairly clear understanding within your organization how much the values, the codes, the policies, the rules are being respected within the organization. And it comes from the very detailed questions you ask during the interview process.
Which you'll come to later.
I'm going to come to, yeah,
explaining how that's done.
Yeah. So when we design this, the definition, what we looked at and to help employees actually understand what we were talking about with ethical risk, we said there are potential hotspots within the organization. It can concern. So you've got this combination of factors which may affect how you behave or how you make your decision, and it may be based on what we do. For example, inspections. Right? So a frontline inspector might be pressured to, overlook something, and we'll talk about that as a potential ethical risk. Or we do many different things. So it could be based on what we do, how we do it. And some of the how we do, I think, goes to the question that was just asked, because what are the controls that are in place? And even if you've got a code of conduct or other kinds of things that guide employee behaviors, are employees even aware these documents exist? And exactly as you asked, are they following them? Right? So we have to know that. So how we do things, are employees adequately trained to go out and do? You can't put someone out to carry out a function within the organization and not know and not give them the training they need to carry out that particular function. And we have to have, obviously, leadership quality plays in as well. Also, where we do it. And I think for us, and it's a very interesting one, because I met in a training session I gave, this inspector had begun with us only a couple of weeks previous. I was doing a V&E session, and she said she was about to head out to a remote community where she would be the inspector of a plant. I'm not sure, I think it was a fish canning, but it's not necessarily relevant here. But the challenge for her was she would be the only inspector of a plant that was the prime employer for the entire little community she was going into. And of course, she wanted to be a part of that community. Her kids would be going to school and she would be friends with the people there. But basically, every decision, she didn't say this, but it's one you realize, every decision she made with respect to that plant could easily impact on the well-being of the entire community, right? And without even being conscious of it, it could potentially influence how decisions are made. So what does the organization do to support that person in that kind of situation? And also, what's important too is whom we have our relationships with, and the nature of those relationships. And I'll talk about the fact that one of the ethical risk profile work was started quite some time ago, and they're thinking about, do they need to do another ethical risk profile? And when I come to that part, I'll mention why you might decide that it's necessary to do another ethical risk profile. So that's what we had as the definition, and that went out to the employees who were involved so that we would clearly sort of help guide them if they were thinking about what risks there might be within the organization itself. The methodology we followed, on to the next slide there, but the methodology we followed was completely in accordance with global standards. It's You start by doing an ethical risk identification, and there you look at all relevant information, document you review you have within your organization, previous public service employee surveys, if you've done an ethical climate survey, your corporate risk profiles, any audits that have been done, all of these provide invaluable information to you. But key to this too are interviews with branch employees, and I'll talk about the specificity of those interviews in just a moment. You then carry out the ethical risk validation and assessment. You do an ethical risk tolerance discussion, and I'll talk about the level that's done at. It goes into then you come up with your ethical risk mitigation planning, and basically you end up with your profile, which is what were your ethical risks and what are you doing to mitigate them, and what is the action, who's responsible for ensuring that that happens. Now, I'm going to go back to our organization a bit and talk to you, just say very briefly why we do 3. Why we have, why we've done 3 to date, and we still have more to do. But basically, this quote from Scott Killingsworth is extremely important, because what he basically said is, what works for a purebred Great Dane is not going to be right for a Labrador puppy. So if you look at our organization and our organizational structure, even though every branch in our organization, let's see the next slide, please. Even though the whole entire organization has a common vision, a common mandate, and follow the same values, the actual work they do to address that can be very different. And so therefore the ethical risks they identify within their specific parts of the organization can be different. So if you try to do one ethical risk profile and you're a massive, like you're a big organization with many different kinds of responsibilities, it'll probably be far too high level and it won't get nitty gritty enough to really identify some key ethical risks. If you're a small organization and everyone has a very similar set of responsibilities, then maybe one ethical risk profile is enough. But we worked on operations, science branch, and policy and programs branch, which actually represents about 85% of our employees that we've done it for. So the first step was ethical risk identification. And as I said, we did an extremely intense document review. And then what we did was we did these interviews with employees. So remember, this same process is followed with each of the branches that we did the ethical risk profiling with. And the way we did the interviews with employees is we actually selected, and it only took, we selected 90 employees. They were actually identified, and we selected them because of what they did. We selected the various jobs that were carried out within the branch, the various levels within the branch. So we would get sort of a microcosm of the branch in the 90 employees we interviewed. Before we even began the whole process, a note went out from the head of the branch to every employee telling them that this process was going to be carried out, telling them the steps of the process, and telling them where they may or may not be engaged in the process as it went along. So I know this is a bit difficult for you to read on your slide, and I'd be happy to share an actual copy with you. But when an employee was identified to be a part of the interview, it was made very clear to them that everything they said was confidential, that we were really wrapping up 90 people's worth of information, and they wouldn't be identified specifically. But they got an interview guide. They got it ahead of time. The interview guide explained the process to them that they would be going to. And on the next slide, you'll see it all actually, oh, it's my only, no, if you click again, it'll go there. That's it. That's it. On the next slide, you'll see that they got all the questions in advance as well. Now, this is not all the questions. You're seeing one of the sheets, but you'll see, remember when you asked the question about how do you know that codes and policies and that are being respected, we would actually say, one of the questions was, have you seen any of the following best practices with respect to mitigating ethical risk and inaction within the organization. You know, so open discussions between staff and that. There were many, many questions. They were then asked about the internal environment of the organization. There were questions about the external environment as well. So they got all the questions in advance so they could think about them, and then they were interviewed. And they might get follow-up questions based on the interview, but they were given time to prepare. So based on how the questions came out, all the research that was done, we came up with ethical risks. Now, I do have a different slide which actually shows the ethical risks that operations branch identified, the risks that science branch and PPB identified. And these are just examples of some of them. But as you would expect, there were ethical risks that were common to all the branches because, of course, they're all part of the same organization. And so there will be things in common between the branches. And actually what came out as common to all branches were the kind of things you see come out quite commonly in the Public Service Employees Survey, as an example. So people management practices, conflicts of interest, etc. But there were risks that were very unique to each of the branches. So they were unique to a particular branch. And as examples, you know, the silos within the branch was actually identified by the Policy and Programs branch as something they saw as an issue. That there wasn't the exchange of information or the transparency and openness they felt should be happening within a branch between divisions and directorates and units, etc. Intimidation from regulated parties, that's pretty easy to guess that that's operations branch, and that's something identified as an ethical risk from a frontline inspector perspective. Some had actually experienced it, but there is always the risk that that could happen. Just jumping down, and regulatory capture is similar. The undue pressure was something that the science branch identified, because here, you know, we actually test products. There is some testing that we do in order for a product to be exported outside the country. Well, of course, the person who wants their product tested wants the results yesterday. And it's quite possible that it's a test that takes, you know, 2, 3, 4 days or weeks, right? And so you can get a lot of pressure on you. This is not all the ethical risks that were identified, but I just want to point out to you why it's important to ensure that you are responding to the unique kinds of jobs that you might have within your organization in order to identify the ethical risks. So once you've identified those ethical...
Hang on there.
Yeah.
I've just had another question from someone, and I'm going to unmute his computer so he can ask the question himself. Would you like to go ahead and ask that question that you just posed, or your observation?
Hi, Ann. How's it going?
Maybe he's muted. Okay. Well, sorry. Go ahead to your next.
Okay, and we'll open it up. It won't take me long. I will be definitely finished by noon, my presentation, so lots of times for questions. I keep saying noon, I know. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what time zone I'm living in. But the next step then is ethical risk validation. We do validation and assessment together. But you have to validate the risks and then assess them. These were done in workshops, and actually there was 4 workshops carried out for each branch. Not PPB, not necessary because they're mostly located in Ottawa, but we actually carried out a workshop in each area. We're divided as an organization into 4 areas across the country, and it actually helped. You could see how each workshop validated and responded in the same way. It's incredible how how good this process is, and where you think, oh, you're only talking to so few people, they actually do. If you do it right, you are actually getting a true reflection of your organization. So we held 4 workshops, and the first thing we did is we said, okay, based on all the documentation review we've done, based on the interviews that we've done, here are the risks that have been identified, ethical risks that have been identified for your branch. And you basically say, do they seem reasonable to you? Right? Or there's some that you go, everyone would argue, no, that might have been unique to one person or something like that. We don't see it as a branch risk. So they validated the risks. The wording could be changed to make the risk, to make it more understandable and to come to agreement so people clearly understood what the risk meant. They did actually identify additional risks during this process, not a lot, but we had a couple of risks, additional risks identified through the validation process in operations branch and one in science branch. Programs branch was pretty much on target. And you had a discussion around those risks. So you looked at the risks, you agreed that, yeah, that is a potential ethical risk for our branch. And we talked about, well, what are the risk drivers? Like, what do you think are the things that contribute to that risk potentially occurring? And we built on that. Each workshop could see what the previous workshop had identified, and then they kept building on what were potentially the risk drivers. Because if you know what the risk drivers are, it helps you when you go to develop your mitigation strategies. Right? Oh, if that's a driver, oh, then maybe we need to be doing something different to mitigate the risk. We certainly made sure that we went through, well, what are the current consequences? If this ethical risk actually became an ethical breach and actually occurred, what would be the consequences to the organization? Because that gives a sense of, when you go into your tolerance planning, whether you have to focus on dealing with that ethical risk right away or not. And then also to help with mitigation planning, and because you've got people sitting there who represent all different parts of the organization, who work on the front line, who have to address these, you know, having them say, well, we already know this and this and this kind of mitigation measures in place. So you have to build beyond that. And it's important to say, and I should have mentioned that in these workshops, we again tried to create a microcosm of the branch in each area. So the different kinds of work that was done within the branch, maybe there were animal health people, plant protect, that this is in our world, food safety people, and different levels within the organization. So once they had a really, really intense discussion of the risk itself, they then went in and did the ethical risk assessment. And this is done, it's a 4-step process which is done for each and every ethical risk, right? So now forget the other 7, we're focusing on one ethical risk, and we're going to create a most likely worst case scenario. We're going to determine the impact of that most likely worst case scenario, then the likelihood of the impact occurring, and finally, you know, whether it's going to be possible, what would be our actual ability to mitigate that risk. And you're going to create a heat map, okay? And this is just, you've seen this is a 5x5 grid. And we're going to talk about risks. Well, basically they're plotted for impact and likelihood, and I'll go through that in when we're actually doing it through. So, and I'm just watching, I know what the time is. So the first thing you have to do is you have to create a most likely worst case scenario. And this is I had never been through this process before. And I really, when I was doing the workshops, I would say, have faith, guys, because this is the most fascinating process to work through, and it works. Because what you ask people to do is you ask them to look at the risk, you ask them to create a scenario if the risk were breached, right? But it has to be, it's a worst case, but it has to be likely. Like, you can't say tomorrow the Parliament buildings are going to be blown off the face of the map. Like, I mean, it has to be, well, I know. There's someone here wondering, but basically you create a scenario which you think, all right, even with all the mitigation measures that you're currently aware of, this could potentially express itself. What would it look like? And every workshop created a different, well, similar but different worst case scenario. But when they voted, when they came up on the impact in that, they actually validated the same level of risk for the actual risk itself. It's really quite a fascinating process to go through. So once you created that worst case scenario, you have to say, okay, if that worst case scenario happened, what would be the impact of it? And we worked on a five level rating scale from low to critical. Each of these were defined. We have this, by the way, in our corporate risk profile and other work. We have these impact criteria done. And so if you don't have it as an organization, you're going to have to create it, which could take time. But this information was available to us. And we told them, because they were going to vote, each of them individually voting on the impact, we gave them across the line, well, say it's critical, you think it's critical. Is it critical from a legal, socioeconomic, environmental, biologic, people, operations, or reputation, strategic, with definitions again? All of this information was provided to them. And one thing about the voting we told them is that if only one of these you think is a level 5, that you might have, say, 5 deaths or more because this breach had occurred, it is a level 5. That's how you voted, period. You know, they don't all have to be level 5. It only takes one of them being 5 to be critical, or all of them being low to be low, type of thing. So based on the discussions they had, they create the scenario together as a group, then they vote on the impact. And basically, when you vote, you get it in real time, and you get the impact voted. There was the occasional time where you got a bimodal distribution, like instead of being clustered in a reasonable together, you got sort of a bimodal distribution where people thought the impact was really low and people thought it was much higher. And you had to go back and have a discussion to absolutely assure yourself that everyone had actually interpreted and understood the scenario in the same way. And basically, once you have those discussions, usually when you voted again, you got what was a reasonable distribution. You then went and said, okay, you voted on the impact of that. Now you vote on the likelihood. But it's the likelihood of the impact occurring, not the likelihood of the scenario, but the likelihood of the impact occurring. And basically then, and you'll see this was the definition you were given, and then you voted on that. It was kind of interesting because it was obvious there we saw some differences in how one area, this is just in the operations branch, how they voted compared to another, because they had recently been impacted by something. And it's difficult for people to divorce themselves from an event that has occurred, even though that event was completely contained, would never happen again, etc. It still very much influences how they vote. So then you get your likelihood votes from everyone, and bottom line is you end up with your ethical risk profile. Once you've done that, you do that for each and every risk. You then have to have a risk tolerance discussion. And the risk tolerance discussion is important because I will guarantee you will have more ethical risks identified than you will have the resources to be able to deal with right away. So you have to make some decisions around what are you going to focus on right away and what can you leave a little bit later or address at a later time. This risk tolerance discussion is done by the highest level in the organization, i.e. in a branch, it's done with the VP, in our case, the vice president, ADMs and other government departments, and his senior management team. And basically, he looks at the risk and he decides, is it acceptable or not? We don't live in a zero risk world. It's just not possible, right? There are some things we do risk tolerance for. So basically, Can you accept the risk? No. If you can't accept the risk, can you act on it? Right? Is it within your control to act on it? If yes, then are you going to avoid it? There are ways to avoid. Are you going to share the risk, or are you going to mitigate it? And if you're going to mitigate it, and this is where we're going next with the next step, you have to have a specific action plan. You have to have someone who owns it and a date to complete it. And I'm not going to go through the next 3 slides in extreme detail. You have more information than a lot of people have with respect to our organization. But what I wanted to show you was that we really did do things, that there really are actions in place, huge major changes to the way we do some of the business and some of parts of our organization. This is just the tip. It's a small example of the kinds of mitigation measures we've done. But notice we've had 3 different ethical risk profile pieces done, and the same 3 themes. Everything could break down into the same 3 themes. What do we have to do for training? What did we have to do from a communications perspective? And what were the new and enhanced strategies, processes, or tools that needed to be developed? You know, when I say it looks very simple, but if you see on the ops slide, you see PrEP. PrEP is our pre-employment program. It's a 6-week program, 1 virtual, 5 in residence, that our new inspectors now go through. V&E training and conflict of interest and harassment prevention, all of those things are taught at the front end of that course and are key for the new employees coming in, so they know what the expected behaviors are. One of the things I didn't mention is we now have, they call it and I just have it on another slide here, which I can't see, but they have an inspection verification team that goes out in operations now. That will go out and drop in unexpectedly on that loan inspector. Yep, that will drop in on that loan inspector and basically say, how are things going? Right? Let's have a look at how the inspections are being carried out, etc. So I just wanted to show you that the themes break down, usually when you see it and do it, they will break down into these major areas. And believe you me, these are ongoing action plans within our organization. So just to sum up, and I can't see my sum up slide in front of me, maybe if you could put up if you could go through, and I'll just look at here, nope, through there, right here. Basically, the messages that we got, I will tell you, when we carried out this process, we got strong cooperation from all employees. They were actually very excited, and they were excited that senior management was coming to them and saying, those are, I thought it was 1:30, but
Well, it's 1:30.
yes.
You wanted to
Oh,
1.
and that's fine, that's fine. This is my
Just
very
put it
last
in.
slide. This is the very last slide. Yeah, the employees were going, great. I get to speak about things that have been of concern to me. There really was, when you saw the most risk, it really was when there was a disconnect between managers and staff, quite honestly. And actually, most of our risks, it says there, the overall risks were generally moderate. They tended to follow when we had the risks that we needed to look at in the orange, in the what is red, and I think it's orange and yellow on your actual slide. And the thing is, when the risks fall in that area, guys, it's going to be your middle managers who will be having to address those risks most of all. Either they themselves need more training to be able to manage more effectively in their realm, or they're the ones who are going to be implementing those things. And I should have said to you, just so you know, when you're doing the mitigation, working on mitigation, that again was done in workshop fashion. There we use the middle managers as part of the, well, what are our mitigation strategies going to look like? Because it's really those people who have to be able to implement them within the organization with support from the more senior management. Communications were extremely important. But the real bottom line is, branch employees, they're looking for that action plan, right? They have to know that it's going to be action. And it's interesting from a timing perspective, The ops began their profile work in 2010. That's 7 years ago. It took about a year and a half to move through the entire process and come up with the plan. They have made such major changes within with how they do their business. You can see the impact that having gone through the process has had. They're now asking themselves the question, should they be doing another ethical risk profile? Ethical risk profiles are not like ethical climate surveys. They'll tell you you should do an ethical climate survey every 1, 2, 3 years or whatever. Really, you only need to do an ethical risk profile if you think something has dramatically changed. The what you're doing has changed, the how you're doing it has changed, the with whom you're doing it has changed, or where you're doing it might have changed. If those components have changed, then yeah, you need to go back and say, have those changes changed the ethical risk that we might be experiencing as an organization? But if everything stays the same, you don't necessarily have to go in and revalidate the ethical risk process if you've done it right, obviously the first time, because the risks are not going to change unless somehow the environment changes. So basically, I go back to that slide I showed you in the very beginning, which effectively said that really, yep, if the ethical risks, you run through the process, you identify your ethical risks, and you mitigate them. And I'll tell you something, guys, you want to be doing it for your organization. You don't want it to be in the press that you had this ethical risk and you had not addressed it. And really, employees going through this process really see the commitment of the leadership of the organization to do it. I think the biggest challenge for, and I don't know who's on the line, but for ethics practitioners writ large, may be in convincing the organization to move forward with their first ethical risk profile, because it's almost like saying, well, we're going to go out and we're going to look for where we may have problems. But the thing is, it's a may, right? It's a, just say to them, it's not, procurement and contracting can have issues with it. You put all sorts of rules around it. Well, where are there other places that we may have those kind of risks that we need to put some measures in place? So with that, I'll close. And I'm open for questions.
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been really a fascinating presentation, and I think that our experience has been that people are very busy and tend to have to leave.
At noon.
Well,
one.
But also sometimes have to leave at 12:30 or 12:45. This time, everybody stayed on until 1 o'clock. So everybody wanted to hear everything that you had to say. Now, we've had some questions. There's one that just came now, somebody asking about access to the presentation in French, la présentation en français. I'll be putting that on the website, or somebody will be putting that on the website.
C'est disponible en français.
Yeah, and it's both in English and French will be on our website. But I've already noted the name, so I'll make sure to send it to that person this afternoon directly. We had some other questions earlier, and I want to get to review those. A few remarks. Somebody who didn't. Well, you know what? I'm going to unmute that individual. So
maybe when you did that, maybe you can identify them so they know it's who you're expecting to get the question
from. I've unmuted Rob Shepard. By the way, we do have people online from Alberta and from different levels of government, municipal and provincial as well. So it's kind of a range of people. So a warm welcome to our Alberta attendees who joined EPAC fairly recently.
Where it's almost noon.
That's right. Okay. So, and here's some other questions. So here was a question. I'm less concerned about ex post assurance, like doing an audit, and more interested in instrumental application of these profiles and codes. And the gentleman goes on to ask, how are behaviors at the management table, especially, being effective to work through decisions with these tools and codes in mind? Is there anything you can say about the impact on the executive level of having gone through this process?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question specifically, but I will say within our organization, and sometimes it's if you've done it once and people recognize what the process entails and the benefits that come from it, it becomes easier to do. The operations one was the first one we did, and there were reasons why, and we got total support from senior management in doing it. And understand, we got total support. These things don't go ahead unless senior management actually gets the importance of doing them and agrees to having them done. So no issue there. And then we moved on to science branch, and it was quite interesting because by the time it came to policy and programs branch, I was actually approached by the VP. And the VP said, I think we need to do the same thing in policy and programs branch, right? We've seen what's happened in the other branches. This is something that is key for us to be doing. And basically it is, yes, it is important that the senior leadership in the branch or whatever your organization looks like remains committed to the process, has regular updates. I know, for example, in our policy and programs branch, just before Christmas, they had a big session with their management teams to say, this is the action plan, this is where we are right now. Do we think the action plan is adequate? Should we be updating it? Should we be doing different things? Are there things that we've done and we can move off? So you do have to have that ongoing commitment. And really, yeah, it is for senior leadership, does have to set the tone there. And also you really do have to have a strong ethics group too that perhaps knocks on the door and says, have you done it, what's done, and that as well.
Here's a different question. It may be something that you mentioned, but it went through a bit too quickly. So return to the validation stage.
Okay.
Who validates the information coming out of the interviews with employees? Was that the focus groups that then did the validation?
That's right. That's exactly right. We took the information. We had an excellent consultant working with us, but we took all the information that came from the review, the documentation review, and actually the documentation review helped us formulate the questions that were asked in the interviews. But then we went through the questions, and you could see in some answers to questions where someone had a unique perspective, but you didn't see that reflected in all the answers. So you consolidated that, and then you sort of created what from those interviews what you felt were the ethical risks that were the highest and priorities that were actually identified by employees. And then you went into the workshop. The validation and risk assessment was done in a single workshop setting. In our case, it took a day and a half. And the first thing the people around the table did, and they represented another microcosm, and they were not the same people who were interviewed. So you got a different group of people sitting around the table, separate from those who had been interviewed. And they basically looked at those risks themselves. And from their perspective in working in the organization, they would go, yeah, we could see that, or no. And actually, there wasn't one risk that was identified that anyone went, absolutely no way. And as I said, during the validation process, some of them added, like there was a risk or two that were added. And we then made sure they were validated in the next workshops that occurred, right? And it was really quite a fascinating process. But people, what was really fascinating is how people built on the drivers. And if you could see the final charts and the amount of information we have with respect to each risk it was quite something.
All right. I wanted to ask something as well about the consequences issue. One of the other questions had to do with the tolerance for risk, and here we go. Determining tolerance is an extremely complex exercise because it is dependent on internal and external factors to the department, and tolerance levels are a moving benchmark. This is really hard to do. And one example that I thought of myself, this was again one of the participants, one of the examples I thought myself was whether the style of the very senior levels regards problems as opportunities for learning, or whether those are treated as career-ending situations. If I know that if something is anything that is detected that is untoward might have me fired, rather than it was an honest mistake and I'll learn from that. That would make a difference. Is that really something that factors in that kind of the changing tolerance for risk?
It could factor in. I was thinking, when you think of the people around the table, the head of the organization is there, his senior management or her, in the case of our science branch at the time, senior management is sitting at the table with him, but the person, in our case, our consultant was that I'm there, and all the information is there. So as they start to, I didn't see, actually, quite honestly, guys, I didn't see anyone shy away from any risk, right? Because they're clearly identified as a risk. Where they might say we can tolerate the risk a little bit more, the person who made the comment, there are internal and external factors. Of course there were. Because in each of the profiles, the employees had identified, for example, harassment as an issue. It's something that's identified in every public service employee survey that comes out. But the head of the branches knew that our human resources branches was working on a strategy to address that particular situation within the CFIA writ large, right? Coming up with a mandatory training program and awareness building, etc. And so for them, yes, it was a risk in their organization identified, but they would tolerate that risk knowing that someone else in the organization was actually addressing it. I did see, it's true, something I might not have seen as a higher risk within, say, a branch got identified as a higher risk based on, and you have to give the head of the organization that, yes, they live in a different world, so they might see something as a risk that maybe someone on the front line does not. And so we addressed mitigation measures perhaps for something that they considered was not tolerable. But it was very interesting, except for those cases where someone else in the organization is addressing it, no risk was dropped off the table, right? And so I can't answer the question what I probably, quite honestly, if I were sitting there, I would try to express my concerns as to what might happen if you drop a particular risk off the table. Because the whole reason you've gone through this process is to identify these and to make a decision on whether you're going to address them. In some cases, too, it was recognized that when doing a tolerance, that it was really essential to focus on this specific risk first, and actually in addressing that risk, you might begin to address the challenges of another risk, right? So you weren't ignoring the second risk at all, but probably a lot of what you did with one risk would actually address the concerns, might address another ethical risk that you were facing as well. I haven't experienced what you're saying, but I could imagine potentially that it would occur. And so that's why it's very important right from the outset to make sure that the organization recognizes why it's doing what it's doing and how important it is to do.
Right. I had a thought when you showed the slide about the risks that are common to all branches.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, well, those aren't just common to all branches.
They're common to all organizations.
They're common to all organizations, yeah. They're there because of human nature and not necessarily because you work for government or you know, whatever. Yeah. A conflict of interest or harassment or just generally management practices.
Yeah, but it's always important to say to an organization, you can't ignore them, right? I mean, it comes to the person about how are you aware. I mean, every organization should have its, well, it has a conflict of interest policy, should have its code of conduct, should have harassment prevention policy. You can have all of those things in place, but you have to be keeping a watching eye on your organization to ensure that those are actually being followed. You have to have managers and supervisors well trained to what their responsibilities are. When someone was saying, how do you make sure managers know? In our organization, I make a presentation to managers and supervisors, which has now become part of the learning. We have a learning, a development program for supervisors within our organization, and it's called Setting the Ethical Tone, Why What You Do Matters So Much. And it talks about the fact that every action they take, every decision they make, everything they say is observed and listened to by every employee. So they set the ethical tone. So are they aware of all their responsibilities with respect to ensuring that the culture of our organization? Because, you know, they say definitely tone at the top is important, but just as important as tone at the top is tone in the middle. And now there's a third expression that's being coined by Roy Snell from the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics. He talks about tone in the trenches, right? Because every employee can impact the ethics of the organization. But the thing is, it's probably middle management, the leadership for sure, the top leaders, but it's probably middle management who impacts the tone in the trenches most of all.
That's right. I've heard that in other contexts. It's ironic that you use the term trenches, a military term, because I remember at various times while I was in the federal government between 73 and 95, getting a sense that there were employees who had come into the civilian public service after some time in the military, and just military culture itself was not the same, and there were misunderstandings because they didn't know how people are going to react to various sorts of habits that they had from earlier in their careers. So these sorts of cultural clashes can happen and can be a specific risk.
Well, and it's the type of thing you begin to learn when you do an ethical risk profile, also an ethical climate survey, but you begin to recognize within your organization that there might be these challenges.
Yeah.
You know?
You mentioned ethical climate survey. Does CFIA participate in the government-wide employee surveys?
Yes, we do. All government departments do. And there's one coming up this fall. There was a little short one done just recently, and then I think there'll be a goal. They do a public service employee survey every 3 years.
Yes, I'm aware of that. And I'm wondering, have you been able to detect any difference in the results on that tool, that survey, that you would link back to the work on these ethical profiles, or is that getting too fine-grained a question?
No, I would say I would link them more to our ethical climate survey. The thing with the public service employee survey, it's not designed specifically to measure ethical climate or ethical risk, so there are many other kinds of questions in it, and it actually has a lot of demographic questions, which can very much influence how a person responds to a survey. Where we see a link is with our ethical climate survey, which are people's perceptions as to how ethical the organization is. And that actually plays into the ethical risk, because obviously if your employees do not see you as having a real, if they don't see their leadership, for example, as being ethical, that's an ethical risk you run. But they're not exact. So, and that kind of thing plays into ethical risk. But every ethical risk that you identify is not related to the climate of the organization, right? Yeah. And that's so.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. I've put up a slide inviting our participants to rate the seminar and give us suggestions for the future. So please do respond to this. And I'd just like to forecast that we're quite likely somewhere in mid-June to have our 6th webinar. And it may well be with Dr. Greg Levine, who's been a member of EPAC and has a practice that includes ombudsman theories and practices. And so we might be talking about the ombudsman role, which I think is something that overlaps with these organizational ethics topics that we do with EPAC. So on behalf of the Board of Directors of EPAC, again, thank you very, very much to Anne for providing this very interesting webinar. And the slides will be available on the website. And thank you, and I will close off now. Bye-bye, everybody.